The sky screamed as the biospores rained down upon us like a hail of meat and caustic acid. I slammed my fist against the frequency dial of the Voxcaster, screaming for evacuation while the ground beneath me convulsed with explosions. A scythe-like claw tore through the sandbags next to my head, showering me in dust and splintered wood. "Hold the line," roared the sergeant before his head vanished in a pink mist of blood and bone shards. They were here, the swarm was upon us, and we were already dead. I curled up at the bottom of the trench, clutching the Vox handset as if it were a lifeline to a world that hadn't yet ended. There was no one to talk to. The channel was drowned in static and the gurgling death screams from Section 4. It was just me left, Kael, a 19-year-old farm boy from the agri-world of Hesperus 4, now reduced to a muddy smear in a trench that stank of feces, cordite, and the sweet, sickly scent of alien ichor. The rain wasn't water. It was a mixture of oil and soot falling from the burning refineries above the valley. It mixed with the clay into a black slurry that sucked at my boots, as if the planet itself wanted to drag me down into the earth before the monsters could get to me. I risked a glance over the lip of the trench. It wasn't an army coming towards us, it was a tidal wave. A sea of chitin and teeth moving with a singular, terrifying intelligence. Hormagaunts climbed over one another, forming bridges of their own bodies to cross the razor wire, unfazed by the last fire that left only small scorch marks on their carapace. Then came the sound. It wasn't the sound of monsters. It was the sound of the atmosphere being torn asunder. A roar that rattled the teeth in my skull and, for a second, drowned out the hissing of the swarm. I looked up. The roiling clouds were punched open by 3 burning meteors. They fell with a precision impossible for nature, straight streaks of fire aiming for our position. "Drop pods." "The Emperor protects," I whispered, the words tasting of ash and iron in my mouth. Tears cut tracks through the grime on my face. "The angels. The angels are coming." The impact threw me backward against the trench wall. The shockwave turned the nearest Tyranids into paste and cleared a 50-meter circle in the middle of no man's land. Smoke and steam billowed from the craters, hissing as the intense heat met the wet ground. Through the haze, I saw them. The doors of the pods blasted outward with explosive bolts. Out of the smoke, they stepped. They were not men. They were monuments of war, cast in ceramite and adamantium. Their armor wasn't filthy like ours. It was a perfect, polished cobalt blue, adorned with gold that shone despite the darkness and the filth. The symbol of Ultramar, the inverted omega, shone white on their pauldrons. Ultramarines. The XIII Legion. The sons of Guilliman. The contrast was so sharp it hurt to look at them. We in the Planetary Defense Force were broken, bleeding, covered in mud and terror. Our uniforms hung in rags, our lasguns were taped and worn. They were purity personified. They moved with a synchronized, fluid grace that belied their immense bulk, the fiber bundles of their power armor humming with a sound that vibrated in my chest. The lead warrior, a giant who must have been a sergeant, raised his bolt rifle. He shouted no battle cry. There was no for the Emperor, no righteous fury. Just a series of short, controlled detonations. Each shot was a death sentence. I saw a Tyranid warrior, a monster that had just torn a Chimera tank to pieces with its bare claws, explode in a cloud of purple fluid as a mass-reactive bolt struck it dead center in the chest. Hope flared in my chest, hot and desperate. We were saved. The Astartes were here. They would form a wall of steel in front of us. They would protect us. They were the shield of humanity. "Here!" I screamed, waving my free hand, rising half out of the mud. "Command post is here. We have wounded. We need cover fire." The giant turned his helmed head. The green lenses of his visor fixed on me for a fraction of a second. It was a gaze without pity, without recognition. It was the look one gives a stone one must step over. He didn't lower his weapon. He didn't change course. He and his squad, 5 perfect death machines, marched straight past our trench. They didn't stop to help Private Jenkins, who lay screaming, trying to hold his intestines in with muddy hands. One of them stepped right through a pool of blood where our medic had died, his massive blue boot splashing the crimson fluid onto the mud, yet the armor seemed to repel the filth, remaining pristine. They were moving with a terrifying purpose, but that purpose was not us. I scrambled up the side of the trench, slipping in the slime. "My lord!" I cried out, my voice cracking. "The flank is collapsing. We can't hold them. There are thousands of them." The sergeant didn't even slow down. He keyed his Vox, his voice booming from an external speaker, deep and distorted, sounding like tectonic plates grinding together. "Brother Valerus, secure the perimeter at coordinates Omicron 9. Brother Titus, scanning protocols active. The relic must be located." The relic. The word hung in the air, colder than the wind. They weren't here for the city. They weren't here for the refinery. They certainly weren't here for us. We were just terrain to them. Obstacles and cover. I watched as a swarm of gaunts surged over the eastern berm, chittering and shrieking. The Ultramarines fired into them, not to save the screaming guardsmen being pulled down, but simply to clear their own path. A bolter shell missed a gaunt and blew the arm off a corporal standing 10 meters away. The Space Marine didn't flinch. He didn't check fire. To him, the corporal was just acceptable collateral damage in the efficiency equation. The sheer, cold logic of it hit me harder than the fear. We had been told the Space Marines were the Emperor's angels, his wrath made manifest to protect humanity. But looking at the back of that pristine blue armor, watching the gold trim catch the light of the burning promethium, I realized the lie. They were weapons. And weapons do not care who they hurt, as long as the target is destroyed. "They're leaving us," whispered a voice beside me. It was Harlin, holding a lasgun with trembling hands, his eyes wide with a shattering realization. "They're just walking through." The Ultramarines pushed forward, a wedge of blue steel cutting through the chitinous horde. They were heading towards the old Cathedral of St. Drusus on the hill, the only building still standing. They moved with an efficiency that was almost robotic. Double tap. Step. Scan. Double tap. Step. Behind them, the hole they had punched in the Tyranid line began to close. The swarm, momentarily stunned by the heavy firepower, flowed back in like water filling a void. And we were on the wrong side of that water. The angels had parted the sea, but they hadn't held it open for us. They had walked through, and now the waves were crashing down on our heads with renewed fury. I looked down at my Vox-caster. The green light was still blinking, searching for a signal that would never come. I looked at the retreating backs of the Ultramarines. They were beautiful. They were magnificent. And they were the cruelest things I had ever seen. A gaunt leaped over the parapet, its jaws snapping. I raised my last pistol and fired, the shot burning a hole in its shoulder, but it didn't stop. As I fell back, kicking at the monster, I saw the Ultramarine sergeant reach the steps of the cathedral. He didn't look back. Not once. We were the Tithe. The blood price paid to distract the enemy while the Demigods did their work. And as the teeth closed around my boot, I realized that to them, our deaths weren't a tragedy. They were just logistics. The Hormigaunt lunged again, its serrated claws sparking against the rockcrete wall inches from my throat. I jammed the barrel of my last pistol into its open maw and pulled the trigger until the power pack clicked dry. Its head exploded in a shower of acidic gore that hissed as it hit my flak armor, burning small holes in the fabric. "Move! Everyone on me!" "Follow the Astartes," screamed Lieutenant Vane, his voice ragged with panic and desperation. We scrambled out of the trench, slipping on the slick remains of our friends, running toward the only thing that looked like safety. The retreat was a chaotic nightmare of mud and laser fire. We weren't a military unit anymore, we were a herd of terrified animals fleeing a predator, chasing after a larger predator in the hopes that it would protect us. The Ultramarines were moving up the hill toward the Cathedral of St. Drusus with terrifying speed. They didn't run like we did. They strode. Each step was a massive, piston-driven impact that shattered the cobblestones of the processional way. I sprinted, my lungs burning, my heavy Vox-Caster slamming against my bruised spine with every step. I was following the blue giants, staying in the wake they created. It was a corridor of temporary safety. Where they walked, nothing lived. Their bolters barked a steady, rhythmic rhythm, one shot, one kill. It wasn't the frantic spray and pray of the guard, it was a mathematical deletion of the enemy. But as we ran, I realized the horror of our position. The Tyranids weren't just behind us, they were flowing around the sides of the Astartes wedge. The Ultramarines were cutting a path for themselves, a narrow spearhead aimed at the objective. They weren't holding the flanks. They weren't securing the rear. They were simply punching a hole, and we were running inside that hole before the ocean of kiting crashed back down to fill it. "Watch the left!" Harlin screamed, firing wildly at a shape in the smoke. A Genestilla, a creature of pure nightmare, leaped from the ruins of a hab block. It was aiming for the back of the rearmost Ultramarine. I saw the Astartes turn. He didn't shout a warning to us. He didn't even slow down. He simply backhanded the creature with his power fist. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The Genestilla was reduced to a spray of mist and broken carapace. But the force of the blow sent heavy debris flying into our ranks. A chunk of masonry, propelled by the Astartes' blow, struck Private Korsh in the chest. He went down without a sound, his ribcage crushed. The Space Marine didn't look down. He didn't pause to check if the collateral damage was one of the Emperor's loyal soldiers. To him, Korsh was just an obstruction that had been cleared. We reached the base of the cathedral steps. The great Gothic structure loomed over the burning city, its gargoyles seeming to weep soot and ash. The massive adamantium doors were sealed, etched with prayers of protection that were currently doing nothing to stop the orbital bombardment shaking the foundations. The Ultramarine sergeant, the one whose helmet bore the white skull of command, reached the doors first. He didn't knock. He didn't look for a control panel. He raised a meltergun, a weapon that fired a beam of fusion heat capable of melting a tank. Breaching, the amplified voice boomed, devoid of urgency. The air shimmered as the beam struck the ancient metal. Molten adamantium dripped like wax, glowing white-hot. With a crash that shook the ground, the doors were kicked inward. "Inside! Get inside!" Lieutenant Vane shouted, waving us forward. We surged up the stairs, a ragged mob of 30 survivors, the remnants of a company of 200. We thought we had made it. We thought the angels had opened the gates of sanctuary for us. I was 10 meters from the door when the sergeant turned around. He wasn't looking at the Tyranid swarming up the hill behind us. He was looking at us. He raised his massive hand, palm out. "Halt!" the voice commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact, as immovable as a mountain. The lieutenant skidded to a stop, his boot sliding on the stone. "My lord! The swarm is closing. We need to set up a firing line inside." The giant shook his head slowly. The green lenses of his helmet stared down at us, unblinking. "Negative. The interior is a restricted combat zone. The relic must be secured without contamination. You will hold the steps." The words hung in the air, freezing the blood in my veins. "Hold the steps," Vane stammered, pointing back at the sea of claws rushing toward us. "With what? We have no heavy weapons. We're out of ammo. We'll be slaughtered." "Then you will die fighting for the Emperor," the Ultramarine said. His tone was not inspiring. It was clinical. "Your function is to delay the Xenos' advance. Buy us time to extract the target. Do not fail." With that, he turned his back on us. The squad of Ultramarines walked into the cool darkness of the cathedral, their heavy boots echoing on the marble floor. And then, the unthinkable happened. The sergeant hit the emergency seal on the inner blast doors. I watched in horror as the heavy metal shutters began to grind shut. I saw the last sliver of the pristine, candlelit interior, a place of safety, a place of peace. And then, with a final, booming clang, the doors sealed. The lock mechanisms engaged with a heavy thud. They had locked us out. We stood there on the steps, 30 terrified humans against 1,000,000 monsters. The silence that followed was deafening. We looked at the closed doors, then down at the swarming city, and then at each other. The betrayal was total. They hadn't come to save the city. They hadn't come to save the guardsmen. They had come for a box, a book, or a bone. And they had just spent our lives to buy themselves 5 minutes of uninterrupted searching. They locked the door, Harlan whispered, his voice trembling. He looked at his last gun, then at the massive doors. He started to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that bordered on madness. The angels locked the door. I griped my Vox-Caster, my knuckles white. Inside the cathedral, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the Ultramarines moving with purpose. Outside, the screech of the approaching horde grew louder. I realized then that there are two kinds of gods in this universe. There are the dark gods who want to eat your soul, and there are the golden gods who want to spend it like a cheap coin. And right now, standing on the steps of the damned, I didn't know which one I hated more. "Fix bayonets," Lieutenant Vane said, his voice dead. He didn't look at us. He was staring at the closed doors of the cathedral. "If we're going to die for their relic, let's make sure they have to step over a high pile of bodies to get it out." The first wave hit the bottom step with the force of a collapsing dam. I fired my last gun until the barrel glowed cherry red, the energy bolts punching through chitin and flesh, but for every monster I killed, 3 more scrambled over its twitching corpse. "Grenades! Throw everything you have!" Lieutenant Vane screamed, his voice barely audible over the chittering roar of the swarm. A guardsman named Jensen, a boy I had played cards with just last night, was pulled down into the writhing mass of claws, his scream cut short by a wet, sickening tear. I fumbled with the frequency dial on my heavy Vox-Caster, desperate to find a channel, any channel, that could bring salvation. The steps of the Cathedral of St. Drusus became a slaughterhouse. We were 30 men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, a thin line of khaki and flak armor against a tide of biological horror. The Hormagaunts didn't care about strategy. They didn't care about pain. They simply threw themselves at our bayonets, impaling themselves just to weigh down our rifles so the ones behind could scramble over them. It was a strategy of pure attrition, and we were running out of bodies faster than they were. I keyed the Vox speed in my ear, scanning through the static. The local PDF net was dead, nothing but the white noise of a dying city. Then, suddenly, a signal cut through the interference. It was crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. "Squad Ultima, report status," a deep voice requested. It was the sergeant inside the cathedral. "Sector Prima secure," came the reply. "Auspex scan complete. No hostile signatures within the sanctuary. Proceeding to the reliquary." I almost dropped my last gun. I was listening to them. While we were being disemboweled 5 meters away, separated only by a thick slab of adamantium, they were conducting a routine sweep. The contrast was nauseating. Outside, the air was thick with the copper stench of blood and the acrid smoke of burning promethium. Inside, I imagined the air was cool, smelling of incense and old stone. "Help us!" I screamed into my Vox MIC, hoping against hope that my override code would break into their secure channel. "This is Vox-Operator Kael. We are overrun. Open the doors. For the love of the Emperor, let us in." There was a pause on the line. For a heartbeat, I thought they had heard me. I thought the doors would grind open and the bolts of the angels would sweep the stairs clean. "Brother Sergeant," a voice said over the link. "I am detecting a localized Vox transmission on the emergency frequency. Source is external. Proximity, immediate." "Ignore it," the sergeant replied instantly. His tone was not angry. It was not cruel. It was simply indifferent. Focus on the objective. The Codex Astartes does not support the expenditure of mission-critical time on compromised assets. Locate the Liber Celestis. Compromised assets. I looked up just in time to see Lieutenant Vane take a scything talon to the chest. The blade, sharp enough to cut diamond, sheared through his flak vest and ribcage effortlessly. He stared at me, his eyes wide with betrayal, before he collapsed onto the marble steps. His blood ran down the stone, pooling at my boots, mixing with the alien ichor. Vane is down. Harlin shrieked, firing his last gun blindly into the smoke. They're flanking us. Kael, tell them to open the door. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell him that I was listening to the gods discuss library books while we died. I couldn't tell him that to the Ultramarines, we weren't soldiers. We were ablative armor. We were sandbags made of meat, placed there to buy them the 3 minutes they needed to find their prize. Target located, the voice in my ear said. The reliquary is intact. Recovering the artifact. Understood, the sergeant replied. Prepare for extraction. Thunderhawk Wrath of Macragge is inbound. Beacon is active. Extraction. They were leaving. But how? The doors were still sealed. A sudden, terrifying realization hit me. They weren't going to walk back out the way they came. They weren't going to fight their way down the steps, clearing the swarm and saving the survivors. They were going to be picked up from the roof, or teleported out. They were going to leave us here, trapped between the anvil of the door and the hammer of the swarm. No. I whispered, backing up until my spine hit the cold metal of the blast doors. You can't. A Tyranid warrior, a towering beast of muscle and bone, crested the stairs. It roared, a sound that vibrated in my skull, and swung a bone sword the size of a man. Private Miller tried to parry with his bayonet. The weapon shattered, and Miller was cleaved in two. The line broke. Panic, raw and primal, took hold. The surviving guardsmen didn't retreat, there was nowhere to go. They simply collapsed under the weight of the assault. I saw Harlin disappear under a pile of gaunts, his screams cut short by the snapping of jaws. I saw the medic, frantic and weeping, trying to bandage a stump that used to be a leg, only to be dragged away into the dark. I was the only one left standing near the door. The Tyranids had paused, just for a second, sensing the fresh meat. They formed a circle around the steps, hundreds of eyes glowing in the smoke, chittering in anticipation. Inside my ear, the voice spoke again. Artifact secured. Moving to extraction point Alpha. The rear guard is unnecessary. Recommend bombardment of the site to sanitize biomatter. Agreed, the sergeant said. Signal the fleet. Begin orbital sterilization of grid reference Omicron 9 in 5 minutes. They were going to bomb us. They had the book. They had the relic. And now, to make sure no Tyranids followed them, they were going to incinerate the cathedral. And us with it. I slumped against the door, sliding down until I hit the blood-slicked stone. I didn't fire my weapon. What was the point? That angels hadn't just left us to die, they had sentenced us to burn. The Emperor protects, I murmured, the irony tasting like bile. Then, the ground shook. Not from an explosion, but from a massive impact on the roof of the cathedral far above. The Thunderhawk had arrived. The roar of its engines vibrated through the stone, shaking dust from the gargoyles above me. I looked at the monsters circling me. They hesitated, confused by the noise. For a moment, in the chaos of my imminent death, I didn't hate the Tyranids. They were just animals. They were hungry. They were honest. It was the blue giants inside, the ones with the gold eagles and the noble words, that I hated. They were the true monsters. Because they had the power to save us, and they had calculated, with cold, unfeeling logic, that we weren't worth the ammunition. The adamantium doors, which had stood for 3,000 years against the erosion of time, groaned in protest. I was thrown violently across the polished marble floor as the massive hinges finally gave way, the metal screeching like a dying beast. "They're inside. The sanctuary is breached." I screamed, though there was no one left to hear me but the ghosts of the martyrs. A massive, bioorganic battering ram, a Carnifex, roared as it smashed through the wreckage of the entrance, its carapace smoking from the heat of the friction. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my boots slipping on the pristine mosaic tiles of the nave, staring up at the vaulted ceiling where salvation should have been. The contrast was absolute. Outside, on the steps, it had been a hellscape of mud, blood, and screaming metal. Inside, the Cathedral of St. Drusus was a haven of cool, scented air and golden candlelight. The air smelled of beeswax and ancient parchment, a stark difference to the copper stench of the slaughter I had just survived. But that peace was shattering. The swarm poured through the broken doors like a black oil spill, chittering and shrieking as they flooded the holy ground. I dragged myself behind a heavy stone pillar, clutching my useless, empty last pistol. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked toward the altar, the center of the cathedral, fully expecting to see the Ultramarines making their last stand. I expected to see them forming a circle of bolt of fire, defending the holy site to the last man. I was wrong. They were there, 5 giants in cobalt blue, standing amidst the ruins of the reliquary. But they weren't dug in. They were looking up. The great stained glass dome above the altar had been shattered, not by enemy fire, but from the inside. Thick adamantium cables descended from the darkness above, attached to the belly of the Thunderhawk gunship hovering silently over the hole. The engines of the aircraft hummed with a low, thrumming vibration that rattled the dust from the pews. The sergeant, the one who had locked us out, was already clipping his harness to the extraction line. In his hand, he held a small, unassuming wooden box. It was no bigger than a ration pack. That was it. That was what we had died for. A box. Wait! I screamed, forcing myself to stand, ignoring the agony in my shattered ribs. I stumbled out from behind the pillar, waving my arms. Wait! We're still here. Don't leave us. The sergeant paused. He looked down from the raised dais of the altar. The distance between us was perhaps 50 meters, but it felt like an ocean. The Tyranids were closing in on me, the vanguard of gaunts leaping over the pews, shredding the ancient prayer books with their claws. For a second, just a second, the Space Marine looked at me. I saw the reflection of the candles in his green lenses. I saw the absolute, unyielding indifference of a demigod who measures life in percentages and probabilities. "Brother Sergeant," the Vox voice boomed, amplified by the cathedral's acoustics. "Bioforms are entering the nave. Containment compromised." "Extraction is green," the sergeant replied, his voice calm, devoid of any stress. "Initiate denial protocols." Denial protocols. I didn't understand what that meant until the sergeant raised his bolter. He didn't aim at the Tyranids rushing toward me. He didn't aim at the Carnifex tearing through the main doors. He aimed at the structural supports of the archway above me. "No," I whispered. He pulled the trigger. The bolter barked 3 times. The explosive shells detonated against the keystones of the massive stone arch that separated the nave from the altar. The ceiling groaned. Dust poured down in thick sheets. Then, with a sound like the earth cracking open, the archway collapsed. Tons of rock, marble, and history came crashing down between me and the Ultramarines. The floor shook so violently I was knocked off my feet. The way forward was sealed. They hadn't just left, they had built a wall to ensure the Tyranids, and I couldn't follow them. They had turned the nave into a cage. I coughed in the choking dust cloud, my eyes watering. Through a gap in the rubble, I saw the blue light of the grave chutes engaging. I saw the Ultramarines ascending into the light of the Thunderhawk, rising like angels returning to heaven. They rose effortlessly, leaving the hell below without a backward glance. "You bastards!" I screamed, my voice cracking, tears streaming down my face. We held the line. We did what you asked. The only answer was the roar of the Thunderhawk's engines as it flared its thrusters, beginning its ascent to orbit. They were gone. The mission was accomplished. The relic was safe. And I was trapped in a box with 1,000 monsters. I turned around. The dust was settling. Through the haze, I saw hundreds of glowing eyes. The Tyranids had stopped chittering. They were looking at me. They sensed that the prey was cornered. There was no more running. There was no more fighting. There was only the inevitable consumption. I slid down the side of the fallen pillar, clutching the Aquila pendant around my neck. It felt cold against my skin. I had prayed to the Emperor every day of my life. I had believed that the Astartes were his chosen sons, the defenders of humanity. But now I knew the truth. They are not defenders. They are accountants. And in their ledger, my life was just a rounding error. A gaunt leaped onto the pew in front of me, hissing, slime dripping from its jaws. I didn't raise my gun. I just looked at the rubble blocking the altar, at the empty space where the Thlangels had been. "Damn you," I whispered to the empty air. "Damn you all to the warp." The ceiling groaned one last time before settling into a tomb of silence that was heavier than the stone itself. I coughed up grit and blood, my eyes burning as the dust cloud slowly revealed the nightmare waiting in the nave. Orbit attained, a voice crackled from the crushed Vox-Caster on my belt, sounding impossibly calm against the backdrop of my imminent death. A Hormagaunt leaped onto the pile of rubble, its jaws snapping inches from my face before a falling beam crushed its spine in a wet crunch. I scrambled backward into the alcove of a saint whose face had been sheared off by shrapnel, clutching a useless grenade. I was trapped. The collapse of the archway had sealed me in the nave, cutting off the only escape route to the roof. I was alone in the dark with the swarm. The dust hung in the air like a shroud, thick and choking, illuminated only by the dying flickers of the votive candles that had somehow survived the assault. Through the haze, I could hear them. The clicking of claws on marble. The wet, rasping breath of things that should not exist. The Tyranids were cautious now, confused by the sudden collapse, but their hunger was a constant, driving force. I pressed my back against the cold stone of the statue, trying to make myself small, trying to disappear. My Vox-Caster, the heavy unit I had hauled through hell and high water, sparked and hissed. The frequency was locked. I couldn't transmit, but I could still receive. I listened to the gods talking in the heavens. Thunderhawk Wrath of Macragge clear of atmosphere, the pilot's voice reported. Relic is secure on board. Vital signs of squad, green. Acknowledged, came the voice of the ship in orbit, a voice like grinding glacier. Status of ground assets. Expendable, the sergeant replied. Local PDF forces were utilized to delay the swarm. All units are presumed lost or compromised. The extraction zone is contaminated. Utilized. The word hit me harder than a bullet. We weren't soldiers to them. We weren't faithful servants of the throne. We were ammunition. We were a resource to be spent, like promethium or bolt shells. And we had been spent efficiently. I looked out into the nave. The dust was settling. I saw the shapes moving in the gloom. A dozen gaunts, sleek and deadly, were sniffing the air. One of them turned its eyeless head toward me. It let out a low hiss, its mandibles clicking in anticipation. But before it could pounce, the sky outside the shattered stained glass windows turned white. It wasn't the sun. It was midnight. The light was harsh, blinding, and terrifyingly pure. It flooded through the broken glass, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of the cathedral. The Tyranids recoiled, shrieking at the sudden brilliance. They were creatures of shadow and biological instinct, and this light was something else entirely. It was the light of judgment. Initiate sterilization protocols, the voice from orbit commanded. Grid reference Omicron 9. Lance strike authorized. I laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that hurt my chest. Of course. They weren't just leaving. They were cleaning up. They had the relic, and now they were going to scour the site to ensure no biomass was left for the Hive fleet to consume. The Blue Tithe wasn't just our lives, it was our very existence. They were going to erase us from history. The air in the cathedral began to hum. The static charge was building so fast that the hair on my arm stood up. The stained glass depicting the Emperor's ascension began to vibrate. "You win," I whispered to the Vox, though they couldn't hear me. "You win." I looked at the gaunt that was about to kill me. It had stopped. It was looking up at the ceiling, sensing the impending doom with an instinct far older than humanity. For a moment, we were brothers, the monster and I. Both of us abandoned. Both of us about to be unmade by the cold, uncaring fire of the Imperium. The first lance strike hit the city outside. The ground jumped. The sound was not an explosion, but a tearing of the world's fabric. A shockwave of pure thermal energy slammed into the cathedral walls, blowing the remaining windows inward in a storm of razor-sharp glass. I curled into a ball, covering my head. The Vox-Caster chirped one last time. "Cycle complete," the sergeant said. "Course set for Macragge. The Emperor protects." The irony was the last thing I felt before the roof came down. The Emperor protects his own, perhaps. But he does not protect the tithe. We are the currency he pays to keep the darkness at bay. And tonight, the bill had come due. The stained glass depicting the Emperor shattered inward, raining a storm of razor-sharp shards that glittered like falling stars in the hellish light. I was thrown against the crumbling altar, my ears ringing with a silence so profound it drowned out the roar of the orbital lance. "Impact in 3, 2. The Vox Ghost whispered, the final countdown of a god erasing his mistake from the surface of the world. A massive chunk of the ceiling plummeted down, crushing the screeching carnifex into a paste of alien biology and stone mere meters from my feet. I stared up at the hole in the roof, watching the beam of pure white light descend like a spear thrown by a vengeful angel. The heat hit me before the blast. It wasn't the warmth of the sun, it was the sterilizing, absolute heat of a star engine. The blood on my face evaporated instantly, leaving salt and ash in my eyes. The Tyranids, those biological nightmares that had terrified us for days, were shrieking. But it wasn't a war cry anymore. It was the sound of matter being unmade. I watched a Hormigaunt, the creature that had killed Harlin, simply dissolve. Its chitin bubbled, its flesh turned to steam, and then it was gone. Sanitization. That's what the sergeant had called it. We weren't being saved. We were being cleaned. I slumped against the base of the statue of St. Drusus. The saint's head was gone, blown off by a stray bolt around hours ago, but his hand was still raised in a benediction that felt like a cruel joke. I looked at the Vox-Caster one last time. The signal light was dead. The Ultramarines were gone. They were likely already in the calm vacuum of high orbit, their armor being polished by servitors, the relic secured in a stasis field. They would be hailed as heroes. The chronicles would say that the valiant XIII Legion descended into the heart of the swarm, recovered the sacred Liber Celestis, and denied the enemy a strategic foothold. There would be statues built. There would be hymns sung. There would be no mention of the Planetary Defense Force. No mention of Lieutenant Vane, or Harlin, or the terrified medic. We wouldn't even be a footnote. We were the grout between the stones of their monument. The light grew brighter, turning the world into a blinding monochrome of white. The stone beneath me began to crack, the marble turning to magma. "The Blue Tithe," I whispered, my lips cracking as the moisture was sucked from my body. It wasn't a tax of crops or credits. It was a tax of souls. We paid it so they could be perfect. We died in the mud so they could shine in the gold. They didn't hate us. That would have been something human. They simply didn't care. To the demigods, we are just numbers on a slate, and tonight, the math demanded that we be subtracted. I closed my eyes. I didn't pray to the Emperor. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just held on to the anger. It was the only real thing left in a world of lies. The beam touched the earth. The cathedral, the city, the Tyranids, and the last surviving witness to the betrayal, all of it was scrubbed clean. And in the silence of space, the wrath of Macragge turned its engines toward the next war zone, its hull gleaming pristine and blue, untouched by the ashes of the men who had died to open the door.